Chapter 17. The Storm. The storm swept from the bit of ice all the way across the Keetish wilds. Perhaps once it had been natural, but our enemy had harnessed it for his purpose, creating a whale of power that all could drink from, wittingly and unwittingly. I learned much about our enemy's actions, but only in hindsight. My scribe asks, which enemy? And she's right, of course. Two foes had finished placing their pieces on the board, but only one was obsessed with removing Kerne before the game began. Jorwin Weaver, the Keetish Cycle. Elayna's senses returned one by one. First, she heard the roar of rain and gusting wind. Then she felt the chill of wet clothes leaching heat from her body. She shivered and opened her eyes. She was laying down, looking up at the beams of her hut, all beautifully carved by Kerne. She sat up. Her hut glowed with firelight from a warm blaze crackling in her hearth. A cloaked figure crouched over a prone man under a Durian army blanket. The cloaked head turned towards her. For a moment, she had a flashback of a bearded face looming over her. But no, the face that looked at her was beautiful. "You're awake," Leusios grinned. Elayna looked around. The unconscious man was Leusios. He looked badly bruised. "Where's Teneos?" Leusios was checking Helios's pulse. "He's on guard outside." "Outside? In that?" The hut shook from a thunderous squall. "The storm lash will be less harsh than the whip," Leusios reasoned. "He almost started a war with Caesonius." Elayna shook her head and looked back at Helios's battered face. "Teneos did that? Will he live?" "He's deeply unconscious. If nothing changes, he'll live." She watched him continue to check over his patient. "Teneos has been hot-headed since the death of his brother. But this—" Leusios shook his head in disbelief. "He went wild, like an animal." "Like an orc," thought Elayna. "You know the healing arts?" "I studied in the finest Lycia in Duria and Avis. Many think the purpose of a soldier is to kill. I disagree. A soldier must win, and I prefer to win without losing more men than necessary. I require my legionaries to have a basic understanding of healing." The cabin shuddered as Kaelsgwyn threw another tantrum in gusts and sheets of rain. "How did we get here?" "Teneos and Kulain carried Helios. I carried you. It's just as well you pointed out your home earlier." Leusios smiled his thanks and then shrugged. "Kulain insisted on heading back to Blackstone. Are you all right?" "Just cold," she shivered. "And wet." I'm sorry. I thought it wrong to take your clothes off." He blushed. Elayna rolled her eyes. She might die of flagged lung, but at least Durian's sensibilities had been preserved. She stripped to dry herself, then threw a cloak around her shoulders. Leusios frowned at the awkwardness of his own cloak, and he tried to shift around his patient. "Let me take that." He unpinned it. "Thanks." Underneath, he was only wearing an officer's tunic and short kilt. Both were soaked through. "You're hardly dressed for a Keetish winter." He flashed her a boyish grin. "The Durians can be stubborn even in the face of your winter, but you're right." Leusios stripped off his tunic and laid it out by the fire. His tanned chest glowed in the warmth of the fire. Blessed divine, this man was gorgeous. He was a perfect balance, muscular without being massive like the half-orc, and athletic rather than wiry like Leusios. His short golden-brown locks and ready smile shone with warmth. The swirling emotions around the owl, Kerne, and Leusios parted. Murgathwin was right. She could make decisions for herself. She was bound to no man and no promise. She watched him lean over the unconscious captain, showing his full thigh and, as his cloth kilt rose, giving her sight of the smooth muscle of his buttock. She studied him unabashedly. Two men fought for her attention, and yet here, if she wanted to, she could seduce and own a prince for just one night. Valiados pulled one of Helios's lids open to study his pupil. His fingers were slender but strong. One bore a simple brass ring that held 2 stones together, one white and the other black. "Would you like something to eat?" she asked. He gave her that enchanting smile. "That's very kind. Thank you." By the time she was dishing up into her wooden bowls, Valiados had finished with his patient and gave her his full attention, but not before she had snuck a roll of barren leaf into her mouth. It had a sappy taste that went bitter when it was ready to swallow, and protect her against male seed. "I've been very poorly mannered," he apologized. "We invade your home, and I've barely given you any attention, let alone conversation." "Your first duty is to your patient," Elayna smiled. "I admire that." Valiados sat cross-legged next to her to enjoy the fire and the bean meal. "This is great." She laughed. "Most kids use it as animal feed." "It's tastier than field rations, and it's hot," he laughed. "On a night like this, it's better than the finest delicacies in Carnassia." "Where's that?" It was his turn to study her. "The city of pleasures, an entire economy dedicated to the fulfillment of human sensation." He looked quickly down to his bowl and laughed. "My parents would go spare if they saw me here." "And not when you're on the battlefield?" asked Elayna. "To be a Durian male is to fight and win honor. Battle is a rite of passage. They would, however, fret that I was alone in the peasant's hut with such a stunning woman." He returned his eyes to hers in mutual appreciation. Their gazes grew in intensity. "Great spirits, you are beautiful beyond imagining," he murmured. No one, not Leusios, not Kerne, not even the owl on their wedding day, had given her a compliment so absolutely. A peal of thunder broke overhead, making the whole hut shake. It made her jump, and Valiados looked up nervously at the thatch as a gust of wind slammed into it. They both shifted closer to each other. "How long are you in Blackstone for?" she asked. There was no innocence in that question. From his look, she knew he understood. "Once business here is done, I doubt I'll be back in person." Perfect. No commitment, no confusing entanglement. He dropped his gaze, not pressing for the moment. She rose onto her knees and leaned in close, catching the back of his head with one hand, while the other slipped the fastening on his belt. He fell back under her weight and surrendered his kilt as she let her cloak slip away from her skin. The two of them rocked with the hut as it shook, and tossed through the wild and stormy night, their cries of passion masked by the shrieking gale and thunderous rain. Ransacking the mage's mind, book by book, scroll by scroll, accelerated Leusios' studies. Every dry theory he found on parchment was brought to life by her raw experience. He saw blocks of stone flying through the air, great spirit creatures like eagles and bats that could lift him into the sky, and he hunted through the eyes of predators. It was late when he decided to stop and told Orthos to settle the major for sleep. Tired of the confines of the cabin, he walked out into the moonlit woods. The moon was full and threw down a crisscross of fractured silver light through swaying trees. "The wind is rising," he murmured and hugged his arms across his chest. If Kaelsgwyn was coming, then should he invest in more grain? His breath clouded as he stamped his feet and rubbed his hands. The forest floor had clusters of snowdrops. Their white flower heads started to bob as a strong wind began to stream through the trees. In the distance, he heard a faint rumble of thunder, and there were flashes in the sky far to the north over Blackstone. He wondered what Elayna was up to now. He listened to the forest roar as the wind grew stronger still. Another distant rumble of thunder. A storm had spilled out of the steppes and into the wilds, and it was coming towards him. He could feel the faint taint of magic in the air. It made him uneasy. His senses began to crawl with trepidation. A great bank of clouds swallowed the moon, and the forest became dark. Leusios swore and conjured a light to guide him back to the cabin. In the distance, he could hear rain beating through the trees. He broke into a run. His light sparked and spat in the rising tide of magic. He slammed the door behind him. Orthos had already curled up on his mat and was sleeping. The Major, too, had made the short step from her listless existence into slumber. The thunder came again, louder. He lay down uneasily, feeling the might of the growing gale. Thunder and the roaring chorus of the trees merged into a turbulent torrent of sound, shaking walls and rafters. Abruptly, the first fall of rain hammered onto the roof. The air grew oily and tingled with the faint scent of spice. Beyond the walls of the cabin, torrents of wild magic surged towards him. There was nowhere to run. His dread rooted him onto his bed, staring at the wooden walls about him. Would mere wood stop it? He squeezed his eyes shut in terror as the avalanche of feral energy swept through the walls and plucked his mind free from his body, carrying his consciousness away like a hapless leaf. Wild magic raged around Leusios. "Leave him alone!" he heard himself shout. Geva swung her broom at his pet raven Horth. Leusios shielded the bird with his back and scooped him up. "It's a filthy beast! I want him out!" she shrieked. She struck again. He lost his temper and grabbed the broom with one hand and propelled Horth up onto a rafter with the other. The raven managed a wing beat that landed him artfully on a high beam. Wrenching the broom from her hand, he threw it aside contemptuously. Geva slapped him. "You stupid child!" She reached for her willow cane. "I'm no child," he growled, smarting from the blow. "And I'm not frightened of your cane. If you don't like Horth, then why don't you leave?" Kerne Miller shambled into the dream. "Who's leaving?" His father's voice was strained from his hangover. "Geva," snapped Leusios. "And good riddance, I say." His stepmother struck at him with the cane. He blocked it with his arm and winced. She had drawn blood. "Miscreant, I should throw you out," she screeched. "You'll never get the charity of others. You'll come crawling back here, and I will bolt the door against you." He would always be haunted by the look his father gave him. The man's broken face creased with revelation. "You could leave." Kerne Miller's eyes went wide, possessed by the desire to be free from guilt. Every day he saw his dead wife in Leusios's face. "You can leave." "Great idea, father. Then who would work the mill? You haven't for years." "We'll hire hands," Geva grinned nastily. "Don't be ridiculous. I live here," Leusios sneered in derision. "I've always lived here." Leusios saw the remorse in his father's eyes again. He saw the man's weakness and was disgusted by it. That would not stop him using it. "You failed to save Mother. You owe me, father." "You owe him nothing," snapped Geva, turning her malicious will on her husband. "You put up with this freak for too long." "Get out, Leusios." Kerne looked slightly surprised by the feverish desire in his own voice. The mad light in his eyes shone brighter. "Get out! Go!" "No!" Leusios stood firm, but knew he was not a fighter. As a child, he had been beaten so often he deplored physical violence. As a teenager, simply standing up to his father normally sufficed. The miller may have gone to fat, but he was a big man. He reared up and bellowed, "Out, or I'll throw you out!" Leusios stared at him in shock. Was the thought of him leaving so compelling that the coward had found his backbone? Just as he was sizing his father up, his stepmother struck. Her cane split his cheek. There was pain and a flow of warm blood. He struck out at her with a backhanded swing. She was out of reach, which left his hand flailing in the air. He felt foolish. He looked foolish. Worse, he looked childish, impotent. Geva laughed. The humiliation was the spark. Lightning erupted from his upraised hand and burned the laugh off of her face. Her hair erupted like dry grass, her skin split and the muscle beneath charred. Bright, jagged filaments of energy twisted and crackled, striking around the room at random and erupting into a dozen fires. Blinking back the dazzling aftershock, he stared at his fingers, now tensed into a claw. He could feel the heat of the fire on his face. The surreal sense of power abstracted his revulsion of murder. Indeed, all morality paled before the intoxicating brilliance of the magic. He experimented by sending a spray of sparks over his father's head and up the stairs. The fool shrieked and cringed. Dizzy, as if drunk, Leusios laughed without knowing what was funny. He gazed around at the burning mill. He had done this. His world spun with possibilities, blinding him to horror and guilt. He woke up shuddering. The pale scar on his cheek itched. The storm still raged through the night. A weak and sickly blue-green light suffused the hut, emanating from... He yelped in terror and scrambled back against the wall, whimpering. The Major was sitting up, looking at him. Her eyes were no longer vacant, but glittering with intelligence. "Leusios," someone said through the Major's lips. "You know the joy of power, a joy few understand. It makes everyone else so inconsequential. That's why using your power to kill comes so easily." Who are you?" he stuttered. "A choice, a tutor, a mentor, or your destroyer." Behind the intelligence, he saw madness. Already terrified, Leusios choked up in horror. The Major leaned closer, a pale blue light glistening in her eyes. The cabin shook from a booming squall. The wild magic blasted through the walls again, and the sickly light swirled like smoke. "Nothing to say. All you desire is at risk," whispered the voice. "The half-orc will take her from you. He will kill her." "No!" Leusios cried as the pallid glow dissolved into darkness. "Lee!" he cried and conjured a light. The Major was lying exactly where she had been all night, and Orthos continued to snore gently. There was an eerie silence. The storm had passed. Had he imagined it? He felt his stomach heave. He struggled out of the cabin and vomited until he retched dry. Wiping his mouth, Leusios looked up at the curious gaze of a raven sitting on a low branch. Its feathers scintillated with black rainbows caught in his mage light. It cocked its head. "No." "Yes." The word intruded into his mind, mocking him. Leusios gaped at the raven in shock. Memories of fire and death tugged at his conscience. "No." He backed away. "Horth? Was this another dream?" "Yes, it is I." The voice echoed inside his mind. It looked at the puddle of vomit. "Is that a gift?" "Why have you come back?" "Because you need me." Horth fluttered down to inspect the contents of Leusios' stomach and shook his head in disappointment. "You need more meat in your diet." Leusios felt too many emotions spinning within him. "I rescued you. I fixed your wing. I defended you when It all happened because of you." He rose from his knees, feeling tears in his eyes. "I could have dodged a broom. My wing was much better." "Then you just flew away. You abandoned me." "Wonderful. You still have a flair for the melodramatic," chuckled Horth. "I took my leave for a while, but you bound me. I can never abandon you. I watched you from time to time, waiting. The power of the storm connected us, and at last we can talk." "You fly off and then expect me to welcome you back because you're special?" he shouted. He picked up a stick and threw it at the bird. Horth skipped nimbly aside with a twitch of his wings. "Next, I think we need to work on the quality of our conversation." The raven was clearly amused. "Get out of my mind!" "You put me in here." Leusios paused, a second stick ready to throw. His rational side was stacking up the arguments against all his childish hurt. As if Horth knew his inner thoughts, the raven finally spoke earnestly. "I can be where you cannot. I can see what you cannot see. Through me you can act and never be seen. I am your scout, your spy, your assassin." "I'm talking to a bird." He shook his head. Was he mad? "You dream of power, and yet dismiss it when offered." Leusios gathered his wits. He was being erratic, and he had to get a grip on himself. "He will kill her," his strange visitor had said. Squeezing his eyes shut, he brought his thoughts to order and stabbed a finger towards the raven. "Very well. Prove your value to me. Find Kerne. Tell me where he is and which direction he's traveling in." There was something smug in the way Horth tilted his head before beating his wings and taking to the air. Kerne and Jorwin had made their camp against the Guardian Peaks. Set back against the mountaintops, Orchy's tower stood proudly above them all. A hoary haze clung to its great peak that was shod in glittering silver and creased with shadows in the waning moon. They'd fled through the night and through the next day. Exhausted, they had risked a fire and taken turns to sleep a little. Jorwin roused Kerne to share a meal before he took the next watch. Dawn was still some way off, and they talked quietly. "The last time I took advice about women, it ended badly," Kerne sighed as they packed the rations away. "Don't be shy," Jorwin coaxed him. "I've had plenty of trouble over women." "Really?" Kerne raised an eyebrow. "Mine ended in a fight, and several deaths." Jorwin's head jerked up as he scented a story. Kerne felt compelled to explain. "It happened when I ran with the orcs. She wanted me, and other orcs disputed my weak blood." He tossed a piece of twisted shrub onto the fire. It caught quickly and gave a loud pop. "I proved to be the stronger and claimed my right." "So you—" "Yes." Kerne grinned to cover his embarrassment. Sex between orc and human was repulsive to Keats. Father Abbot Scutarius had made the point many times to him as a boy, and once too often in his teens. He winced at that memory of his first orcish rage. Jorwin laughed softly to cover his own discomfort. "So, you have more experience of she-orcs than women." Kerne shoved another stick into the fire and raised a cloud of sparks. "She was called Lassak. She wanted to mate for strength and give birth to a superior brood. They knew nothing of love." He sighed again. That had been his mistake. Once again he had been caught between two worlds, accepted by neither. "Then what?" "Direct, my rival, was furious. Lassak was a prize for any ambitious male. He came at me in a fury." Kerne sighed and shrugged. "I killed him, and the tribe bellowed in approval. But my tribe, the Tukarn, were vassals to the Guragor. Drekt had been sired by Kukrak." "Blessed nature! So that's how you ended up killing him?" Jorwin asked. The bard shifted closer to the fire. Kerne nodded. "Kukrak had sired many fine warriors, so my chief Huktaj didn't expect him to take offense. But he did. He came to our camp with a war party, expecting me to run and give him sport." "You didn't?" "No. They would have chased me down eventually. I did the only thing I could. As he stood there, bellowing demands to Huktaj, I charged him." He could still picture the gnarled orc warlord's look of surprise. "The moment he had to raise his spear in self-defense, he had to fight me or lose face." "So, an orc chieftain can send an army to attack you, but if he's attacked, he stands alone?" "Sort of. It's complicated. Kukrak was getting old. Many wanted to see him prove that he could tame a wayward half-breed." Jorwin grinned. "And he didn't?" Kerne shook his head slowly. "Varrig held the war party back while we fought. He remembered Varigg's amused snarl as he looked on. I still wonder if he persuaded Kukrak to go after me. It was kill or be killed, as it always is amongst the orcs. What a waste." "Do you feel bad about acting in self-defense? Kerne, you have to start valuing your life more." Jorwin scolded him. The rebuke was stinging but true. "That's what I struggle with, Jorwin. All life is sacred, and yet my first and greatest skill is as a warrior. I couldn't stay with the Tukarn after that, and wandered the steppes before coming back to the mountains." "You're avoiding the important question," the bard pointed out. "Lassak. You said the she-orcs don't love, but did you love her?" "Desire, infatuation, attraction, yes, all of those. But love? How can I know? It's different with Elayna," he insisted. "I think she could anchor me to a life worth living." He pictured her golden hair and deep brown eyes. He could lose himself in such a memory. "Just tell her, Kerne," smiled Jorwin. "I've seen you face down demons and spirits. Last night you walked into an orcish horde where more than a few bore you a grudge. Offering yourself to her may require as much bravery, but no more." He grinned in embarrassment. "I'm making too much of this, aren't I?" "Aye, you're making a ridiculous fuss about it. Pull yourself together and tell her how you feel." The bard swept the matter away with a gruff wave, but Kerne was still worried. "Her father is barely in his grave." "I said tell her. What happens next is up to her. The pace, the timing, that's for her to lead and you to follow. All she needs to know is you're waiting for her, if she's interested." Kerne felt his smile fade. He had not told his friend about the wild orc. The beast would almost killed her and Leusios. A guttural shout echoed against the mountains. "Kerne!" Jorwin sprang up like a startled forest cat, grabbing his spear. Kerne seized his axe, regretting once more that his sword was broken. "Orcs, Jorwin." He rose to his feet and peered into the darkness. 5. "They're here for me. You should go." "And half your odds?" Jorwin scoffed. "I think not." Of the approaching orcs, 2 had spears, 2 had hand axes, one of which also held a shield, and the largest hefted a battle-axe in both hands. "Hakra," Kerne growled. "Only fools walk where blood feud rules." The largest warrior snarled back in Orcish. A necklace of bear claws and fangs swung from his neck over a simple vest of animal hides. "Then you and I should fight, Hakra. Are you not strong enough to fight me alone?" "You slew kin and chief. You humiliated my clan. I need your death, not your position and mates, for you have none to take." It had been worth a try, but this was about vengeance, not hierarchy. Kerne gave his axe an experimental swing. "Nice necklace. Were you given it?" he asked, pointing to the bear claws. "It's not as if you could kill your own bear." Hakra snapped his jaws and his big hands tensed on the battle-axe. "And where's Akrag?" Kerne continued his taunt. "I thought he always fought your battles, runt." Hakra bellowed and charged, surprising his war party and leaving them several paces behind. Kerne dropped into a half-crouch and grabbed Jorwin's pack from beside the fire with his offhand. He sprang back just as Hakra swung his battle-axe. He twisted and dropped his shoulder strap over the axe head as it swung past. The heavy pack fell, yanking the axe down. Hakra lurched forwards with the weight, and Kerne elbowed him in the face, smashing his nose. No time to finish him. Kerne leapt into an attack against a hand-axe orc who was several paces behind the leader. This one had the shield, but was not ready to use it. He chopped at the orc's neck. The strike cut lower than Kerne intended, crushing the collarbone and carving deep into the base of the gullet and upper chest. He grabbed the dying orc's shoulder with his free hand and ripped the axe free in a spatter of blood. Jorwin backed off to keep the fire between him and 2 of the orcs. Kerne's own position was not good either. He spun to face Hakra once more, with one of the spear orcs to his left. The spear orc had learned caution and advanced with care. Hakra tore the pack from his battle-axe and charged again. Kerne made a quick estimation and took his axe in a 2-handed grip. He hurled it with a grunt of effort at the spear orc. It smashed between his eyes and pulped his brain. The warrior dropped like a grain sack. Hakra was almost on him. He sidestepped and grabbed the first orc he had cut down, who was still in his death throes. Hakra swung his battle-axe with a cry of triumph. Kerne twisted on his knees, lifting both the shield and the dying orc to protect himself. Hakra's battle-axe split the shield and smashed through the twitching arm. The notched edge landed on Kerne, but was softened by the shattered flesh and bone. Hakra howled in frustration and raised his axe to strike again. Kerne whipped his belt knife out and stabbed him in the groin from where he knelt. The big orc twisted away and fell back several paces, yanking the knife out. Kerne swore. He had missed the vital arteries. He picked up the discarded hand-axe and leapt to his feet. As he did so, he spared a glance for Jorwin. The bard was only facing one orc. Too late he realized Jorwin's other opponent was missing. He dived aside as the newcomer lunged at his back. The spear struck his ribs. The tip ripped down the flesh of his back and caught in his buttock where it went deep. Agony racked that leg and his knee went soft, pitching him face down into the coarse grass. He rolled, losing track of both opponents in a fog of pain. "Get up!" he screamed inside, gritting his teeth. He managed to rise and stagger out of weapon reach with his good leg. The orcs knew they had him. Hakra came first, the privilege of the kill surrendered by the lesser orc. There are certain truths about battle. One is that a hand axe without a shield is no match for a battle axe. That truth made Kerne feel naked. He had no tricks left. Jorwin was still running around the fire to keep his opponent at bay. The orc lost his patience and simply strode across the fire. The bard lunged with his spear, not at the orc, but at the fire. "Roitan!" There was enough wood on it to burn for an hour or two. It all combusted in a heartbeat. A pillar of flame erupted upwards and engulfed the orc. The intense light startled Hakra and the spear orc. Then it went dark save for the screaming orc floundering amidst his own flames. Jorwin lifted his voice as only a bard could. "I am Jorwin, the weaver of tales. I bear the power of the Elayna, which feeds on the foolishness of orcs." He swung his spear, letting it glint in the light of their burning companion. A red whisper of elemental power flickered through the runes engraved in its haft. "Begone, before I feed you to the flames!" Right on cue, the burning orc gave a last cry and collapsed. The surviving spear orc gibbered with fear and fled. Caught between his own terror and the reality of the new odds, Hakra backed off snarling. Jorwin let out a theatrical roar. The orc howled in frustration and then ran into the night. Kerne tossed the hand axe down and succumbed to a wave of dizziness. Jorwin stepped forward and eased him down to the ground. "I'll bind it." He twisted to lie on his stomach with a grunt of pain. "Thanks. What did you do?" "Oh, I told you there's power in nature," the bard explained. "On this occasion, it came to me more from desperation than design." Kerne gritted his teeth as the bard cleaned the wound by the light of the moon. The air was heavy with the smell of burnt flesh. "You speak the language of the Elayna?" "My mentor taught me. The good tongue is used between us few bards who are left. We're more than tale-tellers, or the guardians of Keetish lore." Jorwin fetched a cloth strip from his pack. "You'll be limping for a while." "Don't worry, I heal fast." "Really? I hadn't noticed," Jorwin said, his smile teasing rather than sarcastic. "I mean, running around with a sucking chest wound is quite normal. Oh, no, wait. You should have been laid out for a month." Jorwin tightened the bandage with a jerk that made Kerne grunt. Then he got up and nudged the ashes of the fire with the toe of his boot and sighed. "I'd better rebuild the fire." His chuckle was slightly nervous. "What's wrong?" Kerne asked. The bards started pulling wood from their little sack. "Bards of legend had power. If you were anyone else, then I would pretend this was normal to impress you, but—" The bard breathed on the kindling and it sparked into a flame. He placed more wood and watched it catch. "The world is disturbed, Kerne. I feel it in the wind, the earth, the trees. The divine has stirred nature to arm herself against something that gathers in the shadows." Jorwin jumped at a flutter of wings and reached for his spear. "What was that?" "Just a bird." Kerne winced as he eased himself closer to the fire. "At night? Birds do not fly the steppes after dark." Jorwin frowned and then shrugged it off. "Do you think your orc friends will be back?" "Not tonight." Kerne stretched out to warm the wound by the heat of the fire. "Fine. Then you rest," offered the bard. "I'll take the watch." Kerne closed his eyes and drifted toward sleep. It was an uncommon pleasure to know another was watching over him. That concludes Chapter 17, The Storm. In its aftermath, Kerne seeks out Elayna, oblivious to the danger he's in. Thank you for joining us on the journey. If you enjoyed this chapter, don't forget to like, share, and spread the word about Blackstone. Your support makes a huge difference. See you next time.